Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. We have another somewhat sleepy weekend at the box office to cover, but we also have some year-end numbers from Nielsen regarding the most watched streaming movies and streaming series of the year, and there were a few surprises. So we're going to break that down at the streaming part of the show, but let's look first at the weekend box office. Opening at number one was Flight Risk, starring Mark Wahlberg and directed by Mel Gibson. It opened to $11.5 million, the second movie from Lionsgate to open at number one this year. They tend to like January for some reason. Mufasa the Lion King continues its strong hold at the box office. It dropped just 28.7% to bring in another $8.5 million. It's now up to $220 million domestically. One of Them Days held well. It dropped just 32.2% to bring in another $8 million. It's now at $25.1 million. Sonic the Hedgehog 3, which opened alongside Mufasa the Lion King, also holding well. It dropped 38.2% to spend a sixth week in the top five. It earned $5.3 million this past weekend for a $225.9 million total. Moana 2 is back in the top five. It dropped 30% in its ninth week of release for a $4.1 million total. In sixth place was Steven Soderbergh's ghost film Presence, which is being distributed by Neon. It opened to $3.3 million. Audiences were split on the movie, but considering it's indie horror, that's not really that much of a surprise. Wolfman had a brutal drop. It dropped 70.2% in its second week for a $3.2 million total. Its domestic total is now at $17.6 million. The negative audience reception is borne out there in the box office results, so it does not look like Leigh Whannell is going to be replicating what he did with The Invisible Man with Wolfman. A Complete Unknown dropped 17.8%. It had a very good post-Oscar nomination weekend. It brought in another $3 million for a $62.9 million total. Den of Thieves 2 Pantera drops another 54.7% for a $2.9 million weekend. Its domestic total is now at $31.8 million. And The Brutalist is in the top 10. Technically, it was actually in the top 10 last weekend. When the final numbers came in, it was in by about $30,000, which dropped Baby Girl out of the top 10, but it remains in the top 10 with a 45% increase in business, along with a big theater expansion. It brought in $2.8 million. Its domestic total right now is at $9.3 million. And when we look at the top five, two movies that have been there for quite some time are Mufasa the Lion King and Sonic the Hedgehog 3. And we've discussed on the show just how impressive the staying power is for Mufasa. And when you look at its box office returns compared with Sonic the Hedgehog 3, you can see that it is now rapidly closing the gap as far as its total domestic box office. It's already far outpaced it worldwide. You see back there at day one that Sonic 3 opened healthily ahead of Mufasa the Lion King. We talked about it here on the show, but I said on that episode, it's the Christmas season. We don't know what kind of legs this movie's going to have, and you can see that gap narrowly closing. And really, within the last 10 days, Mufasa is closing it much, much more quickly. And I think it's very possible, some might say even likely, that Mufasa will eventually bypass Sonic the Hedgehog 3. That's why you don't always jump to conclusions based on opening weekend saying Sonic is a hit and Mufasa is a flop. Sonic is still a hit, but Mufasa is also doing well. Now, it was a much, much higher budgeted movie than Sonic the Hedgehog 3, but I still think that it's doing well for its size, even with that inflated budget, and it has just stuck around over the last month plus. The Brutalist and A Complete Unknown are both still in the top 10, but when you look at all of the Best Picture contenders in release, I think all of them saw an Oscar bump, or at least an arrest in the decline of the films for people rushing out to theaters, maybe not rushing, but heading out to theaters to see them if they haven't seen them based on the interest it might have generated. I'm Still Here got a 102% increase in business with a 17 theater increase. The Brutalist, as we mentioned before, had a 46% increase in business with a 780 theater increase. I'm actually surprised that it didn't have a bigger bump in business. I think it might just be the length. People can't just go willy-nilly to a 4-hour movie experience. Nickel Boys added 300 theaters and saw a 16% increase in business. It was a Best Picture nominee. And then I mentioned A Complete Unknown. It dropped just 18% despite losing almost 500 theaters. Anora also dropped 25% despite losing over 200 theaters. It was re-released in anticipation of what would have been the weekend after the Oscar nominations last weekend. Wicked dropped 34%. It lost about 200 theaters. Conclave lost about 200 theaters. It was re-expanded prior to the Oscar nominations, but only dropped about 39%. And The Substance lost some of its re-expansion theaters, but also dropped around 39%. So everything's sub 40% or an increase in business. Now, those drops may have happened naturally, but I do think that the Best Picture nominations did help to juice those numbers a little bit. Two Best Picture nominees, Emilia Perez and Dune Part 2, of course, aren't reflected here because Emilia Perez is a Netflix film and Dune Part 2 has been out of theaters for months and available on physical media for quite some time. And that brings us to our Charts with Dan trivia question for this week. Wicked and Dune Part 2 are movies that I think you could safely call blockbusters, but recent Oscar history has shown that the Best Picture winner is not necessarily the movie that's done the best at the box office. And so my question this week is, of the 25 Best Picture winners since 2000, including the year 2000, how many of them have spent a weekend, it doesn't have to be opening weekend, but have spent a weekend at number one at the box office? I'll give you a minute to formulate your guesses. And here we go. The answer is 4. Gladiator, The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, The Departed, and Argo are the only 4 of the last 25 Best Picture winners to spend any time at number one at the box office. The last time a Best Picture was number one was October 26th through 28th, 2012, which I believe was the third week of release for Argo. Dune Part 2 and Wicked are the only 2 nominees this year that were number one at the box office. And barring, I think, an upset win, particularly in Dune Part 2's case, Wicked, I think, still has a fair shot at it. That streak is going to be extended. That's something we've talked about a lot with the Oscars and the dropping ratings, etc. Box office success and Oscar success has not gone hand in hand in the 21st century. And speaking of Oscar nominees, I don't want to just talk about the movies that did get a nomination. I want to talk about the movies that didn't. So our member poll question this week concerns movies that did not hear their name called last Thursday. Which non-nominated film of 2024 should have gotten an Oscar nomination? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean Best Picture. It could be Best Actor. It could be Best Sound. It doesn't matter. Which one of these movies do you think should have gotten an Oscar nomination? And I'm making it hard for you because these are 4 good movies. All We Imagine as Light, which was a great film from India that was not submitted in the Best International Film Competition by its country. Challengers, which I talked about, I thought was going to get several nominations, or at least a couple in editing or Best Original Score. Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. The original film got so many nominations. This one didn't get any. And then Civil War, which was a movie that many people enjoyed. The sound in particular was praised by a lot of people, but was not nominated. So of those 4 films, which one of those do you think should have gotten an Oscar nomination? And you can vote in that poll if you are a member here on the channel. If you're not a member, depending on how you're watching this video, there could be a button for you to push. Or if you go down into the description below, there's a link that you can follow to become a member, because I'd love to hear your voice here. And let's look at the results of last week's poll. It was one of the closest, maybe the closest poll that I've done so far. I asked which 21st century winless movie most deserved an Oscar. All of these films went 0 for 10. I would have put Killers of the Flower Moon on here as well, but you can only do 4 options on a YouTube poll. And this was a tight race. I think 1 or 2 votes probably decided this. The winner with 36% was True Grit from the Coen brothers. I was actually surprised that True Grit won this poll. It just barely beat Gangs of New York, which came in at 34%. Coming in third place was The Irishman with 17%, and then last place was American Hustle with 13%. Very close poll there. Looking at movies that dropped out of the top 10 this past weekend, Wicked dropped out after 9 weeks, and Nosferatu is out after 4 weeks, although both of those movies had very respectable box office runs domestically and worldwide. As far as the biggest theater count changes from this past weekend, Den of Thieves 2 Pantera actually had that dreaded week 3 drop with 900 theaters gone. It's still in 2,108. The Wild Robot lost the vast majority of theaters that it added ahead of what it anticipated were Oscar nominations until they were delayed. It lost 827 theaters. It's now in 249. The Brutalist added 780 theaters. It's now in wide release with 1,118 total. Baby Girl lost about half of its theaters. It was out of 683. It's now in 777. And Nosferatu lost 572 theaters. It's still in 1,973. And looking at what I like to call our road to recovery, the red line is the weekend box office average for 2021 to 2024. The blue line is the average from 2015 to 2019. And the dotted black line is what we've seen so far this year. And you can see that we are once again much closer to where we have been than where we were pre-pandemic. This has not been a remarkable January for the box office. Not a terrible one, certainly. We're at least not down to the lows that we've averaged in the last few years, but not a great one either. And it's actually a great time because we've been through, believe it or not, 1 month of the box office season to look at the market share and the cumulative box office for the year so far. So looking at the market share so far this year, Disney is leading all studios with 35.15% of the market share. This is all tickets sold since January 1st, whether the movie came out in 2024 or 2025, which means that Mufasa is really helping to juice those numbers, a complete unknown, Moana 2. So Disney had a good January. Universal comes in second at 20.2%, Wicked and the holdover from that, as well as Nosferatu helping that number. Paramount's at 17.3%. That's largely Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and the fact that it's done so well past the beginning of the year. All other studios actually come in fourth place at 11.6%. That's Neon. That's A24. Basically anyone but the major studios. Lionsgate, as I mentioned, has had 2 number 1 openers, but that's only translated to 8.8% of the box office so far this year. Sony is at 5.68%. And then there's 2 tiny little slivers you couldn't even fit text on. That is Amazon MGM, which is at 0.92% of the box office in 2025, and Warner Brothers, which has basically sat out this whole year at 0.27%. So really nothing extending into 2025 for Warner Brothers, and it is the lowest earning of all the studios that we've looked at so far this year. This is the cumulative domestic box office for the year for 2015 through 2025. Now, of course, this just represents January in each of those years. And if you look at 2025 versus 2024, it's almost exactly even. We're pretty much flat with last year. Now, it will tick up a little bit because there are a couple of days left in the month that will be included in that total. So it looks like we'll go over 500 million for 2025, but nothing substantially better than we did last year. And keep in mind, theater owners are wanting an improvement over last year, not just to stay flat. We're still well behind where we were in 2023 even. And I mean, just look at the difference between pre and post pandemic. So a lot of work to do for the studios and theaters in February and beyond if they want to start improving on what we did last year. Let's take a look outside the domestic marketplace and see what the top 5 films internationally are. This is all markets outside of the US and Canada. And the number 2 movies remain the same. Mufasa the Lion King at $15.4 million and Sonic the Hedgehog 3 at $10.6 million. Octopus with Broken Arms stays in third place at $6.7 million. This is a movie from China. However, we are entering the week of the Chinese New Year celebration, which usually generates a lot of revenue from the Chinese box office. So on next week's show, I would anticipate some big numbers, not from US films, but from films showing in China, because they tend to flood theaters in China with new releases as people have the time and want to celebrate by going to the movies. In fourth place is Paddington in Peru, which is still not open here domestically. It won't be for a couple more weeks, but it made $6.3 million from other markets. And Moana 2 rounds out the top 5 at $5.8 million. When you take those international numbers, you combine them with our domestic numbers, we get our top 5 films worldwide. Mufasa the Lion King remains number 1. It dropped 24.3%, another $24.1 million. It's now at $626 million worldwide. Flight Risk opens to $16.2 million worldwide, largely driven by its domestic opening weekend. Sonic the Hedgehog 3 dropped 32.4% for a $16.1 million weekend. Its global total now is at $446 million. Moana 2 dropped about 27% for a $10.1 million weekend, adding to its $1 billion plus total. And A Complete Unknown has its good hold domestically as well as some international markets to thank for being the 5th highest grossing movie in the world this past weekend at $8 million. Its worldwide gross is now at $74.2 million. Let's take a look now at what I like to call some of our specialty charts, and we'll start with the per theater average for this past weekend. At number one was the documentary Liza, a truly terrific, absolutely true story, a documentary about the life of Liza Minnelli. It was playing in just one theater and brought in $19,854 in that theater. I'm Still Here is in second place in 17 theaters, bringing in $13,518 per theater. Flight Risk and Wide Release is a distant third at $3,665 per theater in each of its 3,000 plus theaters. Bad Shabbos, which has been on this list, I think at least once before, a few weeks ago, played once again in one theater this past weekend, bringing in $3,136. And One of Them Days in its second weekend rounds out the top five, bringing in $2,994 per theater in each of its 2,600 plus theaters. Looking at the top movies in limited release, which I define as 1,000 theaters or fewer, at number one was the Fathom Events Metropolitan Opera presentation of Aida, which brought in $1.3 million in an unknown number of theaters. September 5, which is another movie that had its expansion pushed until after the Oscar nominations, but didn't net a whole lot of major nominations, brought in $745,000 in 395 theaters. Another movie from Paramount that's just not paying off like they'd wanted it to. Sonic 3 seems to be the exception to what's been going on with them lately. Skyforce, which is a Hindi language action film from India focusing on the first airstrike in India's history, brought in a little over $430,000 in an unknown number of theaters. The Colors Within, which is an anime film from Japan, brought in $373,000 in 570 theaters. And The Last Showgirl rounds out the top five in limited release at $367,000 from 390 theaters. Looking at the 2025 annual domestic box office, these are movies that were released in 2025. Den of Thieves 2 Pantera remains number one for right now at $31.8 million, but One of Them Days is closing that gap pretty quick at $25.1 million. Wolfman stands at $17.6 million, followed by Flight Risk at $11.5 million, Presence at $3.3 million, and Brave the Dark, which opened outside the top 10 at $2.2 million. Then we have three holdovers at 7, 8, 9, and one spot that is TBD. Of course, we'll fill that in because we have a couple of wide releases opening this weekend. Looking at the 2025 box office as far as all tickets sold, even movies carried over from 2024, Mufasa the Lion King's at number one. It's made $92.8 million just since January 1st. Sonic the Hedgehog 3 is at $74.3 million. Moana 2 moves up to second at $45.9 million, followed by Nosferatu at $45 million. Wicked in fifth place at $35.8 million. A Complete Unknown at $34.4 million. And then our first 2025 release on this chart, Den of Thieves 2 Pantera, which is in seventh place at $31.8 million. One of Them Days enters the chart at number 8 at $25.1 million. Baby Girl drops one spot to number 9, and Wolfman is at number 10 for now at $17.6 million. Going back to look at the 2024 worldwide box office, we had a little bit of movement because revenue does count backwards to 2024, even if it was made in 2025. Wicked is now the fifth highest grossing 2024 release at $717.1 million. That bumps Dune Part 2 down to number 6 at $714.4 million. Wicked is going to stay in that fifth spot unless it is usurped by Mufasa the Lion King. We'll see how much it still has in the tank. It's at number 7 at $626.6 million, ahead of Godzilla Kong the New Empire, Kung Fu Panda 4, and YOLO. So that's what's going on at the box office, but there is some interesting stuff to look at in the world of streaming. Now, last week we did 2 weeks of Netflix numbers, so I'm not going to have Netflix numbers for you on this week's show, but that's probably a good thing because there's a lot of data to look at from Nielsen. Not only did they release the viewing numbers for the last week of the year, December 23rd through 29th, but they also released their own report as far as the most watched movies and shows of the year, and it differs a little bit from the data that I have because I only have access to the top 10 streaming movies every week, the top 10 original shows, and the top 10 library shows, whereas Nielsen has access to all the data, whether a show or movie was in the top 10 or not. And there are some very interesting differences between my numbers and their numbers that we're going to break down. But let's look first at the last week of the year. The Nielsen numbers are delayed by about a month because they have a lot of data to compile. So these are the 10 most watched streaming movies for the week of Christmas, December 23rd through the 29th, 2024. At number 1 was Red One on Amazon. It retakes the top spot. The most watched movie the week of Christmas, I guess probably not a surprise. These are US numbers only, by the way. And second was Carry On at 25.6 million hours watched, followed by The 6888 on Netflix at 22.1 million, so a good 1-2 punch for Netflix there. Home Alone on Disney Plus comes in fourth at 15.2 million hours watched, followed by Elf and How the Grinch Stole Christmas, two not really surprising choices for people to watch on the week of Christmas. Godzilla Kong: The New Empire hit Netflix, so it re-enters the chart alongside Die Hard. This is the first time, according to my research, that Die Hard has been on the Nielsen charts. It was available on Hulu and brought in 12 million hours watched, so whether you think it's a Christmas movie or not, it is definitely a movie that people watch around Christmas. Christmas Vacation comes in ninth place at 11.7 million hours watched, and The Grinch, the animated film on Peacock, rounds out the top 10 at 11.7 million hours watched. And when we look at the weekly performances for streaming movies in 2024, whether it was the debut week or not, Red One brackets that chart. It had the best streaming weekly performance for any movie in 2024 at 35 million hours watched in its debut week, and now the fifth best performance for a streaming movie in week number 3 at 30.1 million hours watched. The middle is made up of Beverly Hills Cop Axel F at 34.1 million hours watched. The second week of Carry On at 32 million hours watched. I think I transposed those on last week's show and heard from several people. You can't make a mistake on this show. You guys are just too eagle-eyed. In fourth place was Inside Out 2 on Disney Plus. Its debut week brought in 30.3 million hours watched. And when we look at the most watched streaming movies in the US since 2020, according to the reported numbers, and again, these are just according to the top 10 numbers from Nielsen, Elf has now hit the top 5 since 2020 at 172.8. That seasonality really comes back every week and helps to boost its numbers. Encanto, Moana, and the Super Mario Brothers movie are numbers 1, 2, and 3, followed by Home Alone. Then we have Elf, Luca, Turning Red, Elemental, Sing 2, and Glass Onion. As far as the most watched streaming shows for the week of December 23rd through the 29th, at number 1 was the return of Squid Game with 82 million hours watched. Spoiler alert, that is the best number that any show put up in 2024, and we'll look at that in just a couple minutes. Virgin River comes in second place on Netflix at 37.5 million hours watched, followed by Bluey, Landman, and The Equalizer. Dexter returns to the top 10 at 13.9 million hours watched at number 6, followed by Family Guy and Bob's Burgers. SpongeBob SquarePants is back in the top 10 at 12.7 million hours watched, and Grey's Anatomy rounds out the top 10. And yes, as I mentioned, the debut of Squid Game was the best weekly performance for any show in 2024 at 82 million hours watched. That bumps Bridgerton down to second place. It had 57.7 million hours watched back in June when it debuted the second half of its season. That's how wide the gap is with Squid Game. It's not just a global hit, it is a huge domestic hit, and it won by a landslide. Fool Me Once gets bumped down to third place, followed by Fallout, and then Bridgerton again when the first part of its season debuted at 45.9 million hours. But yeah, not even close with Squid Game and the debut of season 2. As far as the top 20 streaming shows, when you look at them by watch time per available episode, at number 1 was your friend Nate Bargatze, who had a new comedy special. It was just one episode, so it had a leg up on this chart at 6.57 million hours watched per episode. Squid Game brought in 5.13 million hours watched per episode, and keep in mind that's split between season 1 and season 2, although the Netflix numbers show that a good amount of people went back to watch season 1 again. Beast Games did not score enough to make the overall top 10, but its 3 episodes available on Amazon Prime Video brought in 2.26 million hours watched per episode. So definitely an impressive performance, but even with a much lower episode count, could not stand up to the domination of Squid Game. Landman comes in at 2.25 million hours watched per episode, followed by La Palma on Netflix at 1.81 million hours watched per episode. And Black Doves also gets over a million hours watched per episode at 1.24 million. No Good Deed comes in 7th place, followed by Virgin River, Special Ops Lioness, and The Equalizer, which brought in 277,000 hours watched for each of its 63 episodes. And when we look at the most watched original streaming series since Nielsen started reporting numbers back in 2020, one change in the top 5, Virgin River now moves up to number 5, which bumps The Crown down to number 6. No surprise, because Virgin River is still putting out new episodes and The Crown is done. Cobra Kai, Manifest, The Great British Baking Show, and Wednesday round out the top 10, while the top 4 consist of Stranger Things, Ozark, Bridgerton, and Love is Blind. So as I mentioned before, Nielsen put out their list of the most watched movies and shows of the year, and because they can access data beyond the top 10, they have so much more information than I have. There are some key differences between the list that I've been keeping based on the reported ratings of the top 20 shows and the top 10 movies and their list. So let's look at the difference there, and let's start with the most watched movies of 2024. According to Nielsen's reported ratings, this is my list. Moana at number 1, followed by the Super Mario Brothers movie. Red 1 moves up to number 3, although look at that hours watch number on my list, and then we'll look at the one on Nielsen's list because there's a mystery here that I can't quite solve. Carry On is at number 4 at 85.9 million hours watched, followed by Inside Out 2, The Grinch, which enters the chart at number 6, Damsel at number 7, Trolls Band Together at number 8, Rebel Ridge at number 9, and Beverly Hills Cop, Axel F at number 10. The Union drops out of the overall top 10. So that's my list. This is the list released by Nielsen, and the top 3 remain the same with Moana, the Super Mario Brothers movie, and Red 1, although Red 1 has substantially higher hours watched on Nielsen's chart versus the one that I put together. I have 92.8 million hours watched. They have 138 million hours watched. And the reason that doesn't make much sense to me is because Red 1 has only been out for 3 weeks and it's been on the Nielsen top 10 chart every single week. And so I thought that I had access to all of the watch hours for Red 1, but either there was some kind of a reporting error or some other sort of oversight because Nielsen is reporting many more hours watched for Red 1 than I had based on their published data. I mean, they're the ones with the data. They're the ones that have the source. So obviously those watch hours came from somewhere, but that is an enduring mystery for me because everything else, sure, that could have accumulated watch time while it wasn't in the top 10, but that's not the case with Red 1. In 4th place on Nielsen's list was Trolls Band Together at 124 million hours watched. That is substantially higher than it is on my list, which was based just on the weeks where it made the top 10. So obviously it was sitting outside the top 10, gathering a lot of watch time. And that's really the case with the rest of the 10 movies, which are not on my list, and they're all animated films. Minions at number 5, Encanto at number 6, Frozen at number 7, Paw Patrol the movie at number 8, Inside Out at number 9, and The Boss Baby at number 10. What the final Nielsen numbers for the year tell me is that even though we have new movies that are entering the top 10 all the time and taking those 1 through 10 spots, these films are consistently just outside the top 10, putting up really decent numbers every single week. And that's why I like to look at things like these year-end charts because they have access to things that I don't. So I will continue as we go into 2025 to track the most watched movies of the year. But keep in mind, those numbers will change when we get to the end of the year and have the full set of data. As far as the most watched library streaming series of the year, these are shows that are acquired, not original programming. These are the top 10 according to the numbers that I had access to. Bluey at number 1, followed by Grey's Anatomy, Family Guy, NCIS, and Bob's Burgers. Young Sheldon is in 6th place, followed by Criminal Minds, Suits, The Big Bang Theory, and SpongeBob SquarePants, which moves into the top 10 on my chart the very last week of the year, dropping out Law & Order SVU. When you look at Nielsen's numbers, they're actually pretty close to mine because a lot of these movies are in the top 10 every single week. So there's not a whole lot of lost watch time, if you will, for weeks when they are outside the top 10 and I don't have the data. Bluey is at number 1, Grey's Anatomy is at number 2, Family Guy's at number 3. Bob's Burgers and NCIS switch places between my list and Nielsen's list. That's not such a big deal. Young Sheldon is at number 6. The Big Bang Theory gets a boost to number 7 on Nielsen's list versus number 9 on my list, which means it's outside the top 10 a lot, racking up that view time. Same with Law & Order SVU, which is at number 8 on Nielsen's final list and was bumped out of my list, but again, it's still doing well even when it's not in the top 10. Criminal Minds is at number 9 and SpongeBob SquarePants is at number 10. So really the only show that is on my list and not on Nielsen's list is Suits. And that makes sense because Suits was in the top 10 a lot of weeks, racking up view time while other shows were underneath, quietly gathering that same view time. But the differences are bigger when we look at the most watched original streaming programming of 2024. According to my list, based on the reported top 10 data, Bridgerton was at number 1, followed by Love is Blind, Fallout, The Boys, and Fool Me Once. The Lincoln Lawyer is in 6th place, followed by Monsters, Lyle and Eric Menendez, Evil, Love Island, and Avatar: The Last Airbender. When we look at Nielsen's data, first of all, no original streaming series is among the 10 most watched of the year. They're all library or acquired series, but that's not a shocker because when you look at it according to watch time, those shows have many more episodes and many more seasons. Bridgerton is still at number 1. Love is Blind is still at number 2. The Boys actually jumps out from number 4 to number 3, which means that there was a hefty amount of watch time for that show that did not occur in the top 10. Maybe a lot of people that were catching up or that were watching the show after it dropped out. The Lincoln Lawyer jumps from number 6 to number 4 from my chart to Nielsen's final chart, and Fallout falls to number 5, but those aren't huge differences. At number 6 on Nielsen's chart, though, is a show that does not appear on mine, which is Futurama on Hulu, bringing in 195.8 million hours watched. So it seems like that show is usually doing good numbers, but not quite enough to break into the top 10. When you look at Bob's Burgers, Family Guy, Futurama, Hulu's doing really well with animation. That seems to be one of their biggest strong suits, maybe the strongest of all the other streaming services. Fool Me Once is at 7th place, a little bit lower than it was on my list. Evil is at number 8. That's the same between both lists. Here's another show that surprised me, Gabby's Dollhouse. Very rarely in the streaming top 10, and yet the 9th most watched original series of the year, according to Nielsen. So, like many of the animated films that we saw on the movie list, Gabby's Dollhouse obviously a show that's a hit with younger audiences that are viewing it consistently, just not enough to get it into the top 10 every week. And then we have Reacher from Amazon, which didn't make the numbers according to my calculations, but again, obviously a lot of people watching that show throughout the year, enough to make it number 10 overall. And finally, when we're looking at the top Nielsen shows as far as watch time per available episode, Fallout actually comes in at number 1, bringing in 24.9 million hours watched per episode for each of its 8 episodes. That's enough to beat Fool Me Once, which came in 2nd place at 22.69 million hours watched per episode. And then we have a pretty hefty drop, probably because these other shows have more episodes. Bridgerton comes in at 14.88 million hours watched for each of its 24 episodes, followed by Reacher at 11 million hours of watch time for each of its 16 episodes. The Lincoln Lawyer brought in nearly 7 million hours watched per episode for each of its 30 episodes. Then we have The Boys at 6.86 million hours watched for each of its 33 episodes. Bluey at 6 million hours watched per episode for 154 episodes. That just goes to show you the volume of watch time that Bluey was able to generate this year. Young Sheldon, also impressive at 141 episodes, still bringing in 3.79 million hours watched per episode. Evil's at 3.59 million hours watched per episode, and Love is Blind is at 2.86 million hours per episode. So that is the streaming year that was, at least here in the US, according to Nielsen. And I love when they release these year-end numbers because it does give you a new perspective. And, you know, I wish that I had access to all that information because my numbers could reflect Nielsen's numbers throughout the year. But it's also kind of interesting to see how the top 10 movies or shows kind of shape your perception of what's being watched and then what's actually being watched in the background that you don't know about. Just another thing to contrast and compare at the end of the year. So we'll do this again in a year. However, starting next year, we're going to restart the clock on the Nielsen numbers as we start getting numbers for 2025. And that wraps up what I've got for you this week. Before we go, though, I want to take a look at this upcoming week as far as some things that are in theaters and on streaming that you might be interested in. First of all, tonight on Hulu is the debut of the new show Paradise, which stars Sterling K. Brown as the president's head of security. It's a new series from creator Dan Fogelman, and the first 3 episodes will premiere tonight, with new episodes following weekly. Then tomorrow, Detective Chinatown 1900 hits theaters here in the US, at least some theaters, to kick off the celebration of Chinese New Year, and I'm expecting a big box office number internationally from that film next week. Also tomorrow, Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man debuts on Disney+. It's an animated series that was at one time supposed to be directly tied into the MCU. It now takes place in an alternate timeline. Also debuting tomorrow is Mythic Quest Season 4, which debuts its first 2 episodes on Apple TV+. On Thursday, hitting Amazon Prime Video is the comedy film You're Cordially Invited. Reese Witherspoon's sister and Will Ferrell's daughter have booked their weddings at the same resort, and I'm sure hijinks will ensue. Also debuting on Thursday is season 2 of The Recruit on Netflix. Noah Centineo returns for a 6-episode second season, a little over 2 years after season 1 ended, which really on Netflix terms isn't so bad. And then on Friday, we have a number of films hitting theaters. First of all is the movie Companion, which I don't know much about, but which looks really interesting. Also hitting theaters is the family film Dog Man, about a cop who is part dog, part man. It's right there in the title. And also hitting theaters in many parts of the country is a film called Love Me, which played the Sundance Film Festival last year. Kristen Stewart plays a buoy and Steven Yeun plays a satellite in a film that's set on a post-apocalyptic Earth. I did see this virtually last year at Sundance. It wasn't necessarily on my wavelength, but I have to say it is a very creative film. Certainly unlike any other movie I've seen before. So if you're interested in something that's a bit more experimental, then maybe you can check out Love Me. Also opening in many theaters nationwide is Green and Gold. It's being released through Fathom Events. Craig T. Nelson plays a farmer who bets on the Green Bay Packers in order to save his family farm or potentially lose it. Also in many theaters nationwide on Friday is Valiant One. An Army helicopter crashes in North Korea in this action film from Briarcliff, the company that also distributed The Apprentice, which netted Oscar nominations for Jeremy Strong and Sebastian Stan. In limited release this weekend, opening in some venues around the country, is the Best Documentary nominee No Other Land, which still does not have official U.S. distribution. I think I misspoke in my Oscar video saying that it focused on Gaza. It's actually centered on the West Bank, but it is a documentary that is very critically acclaimed, but is difficult to see right now. And I'm really hoping that somebody picks up distribution to make this easier to see if you are not in one of the limited markets where it's opening. But if it is opening near you, I've heard very good things about the film. And then opening in some theaters this Friday is Screamboat, the inevitable Steamboat Willie public domain horror movie. Why do they always make terrible horror movies? Can't somebody make the brutalist of public domain movies? Can we have a little bit of ambition? Well, not with this one, because Steamboat Willie is going on a murder rampage or something. I don't know. I'm done with those movies. And those are just some of the things you can find in theaters and on streaming this weekend. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode. Be sure to stay tuned right here on the channel. Subscribe, hit that bell, because I'm going to be doing award season news, movie reviews, all the stuff that we do, in addition to returning next week to break down the box office. Thank you so much, though, for tuning in to this video. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.